So, up to this point, we've talked about a lot of different scholars that have influenced the field of anthropology as a whole. But now we're going to start talking about some scholars that influenced like cultural anthropology more specifically. So, we've talked about a lot of people like geologists, philosophers that exist outside of the field of like the social sciences. But now we're going to talk a bit about like how some of these ways of thinking specifically influenced how we looked at other people. And by we, I mean Europeans at the time. We've discussed how they're at the center of everything. Well, they place themselves at the center of everything. So we're going to talk about how that shaped the way that people in the European continent perceived other cultures and other ways of being. So, we've talked about the ways people thought about Earth, evolution, briefly, like society in general, and all of this influenced a lot of the scholars of the 19th century that are going to have a huge impact on the field, the early field of anthropology. It wasn't a field at the time, more so like we were part of the social sciences. No one really was an anthropologist at this time until about like the early 1900s, but one of the earliest influential scholars that is going to change what or influence what anthropology becomes is Herbert Spencer. And he was really interested in this idea of evolution. And he was like, you know what? Bet I understand that animals are changing throughout time. Is that something do you that could maybe have happened to humans as well? So he was like, maybe I'm going to take that framework of evolutionary thinking, that descent with modification, and try to apply it to societies. So he wasn't necessarily thinking about humans on a biological species level. He was more thinking about like groups and how the way that people organize themselves into different groups did that change over time. So he thought that, society started as, relatively small, more disparate. They didn't really have strong ties, didn't really have a strong sense of organization. But as they got bigger and bigger over time, they would involve complexities. Like we've got institutions like the IRS and all these departments and these cabinets and government, right? So the bigger we get, the more we kind of need these organizational hierarchies. And he thought this was basically a form of evolution, that things are becoming more complex over time. So he thought, hey, this is pretty similar to what, if life started as unicellular in this like primordial soup at the beginning of the earth, and over time it became more and more complex, and now we have got multicellular beings just like us humans with these incredibly complex brains, that this is what's happening in societies over time. So because he saw these parallels, he called this social evolution. Now, the problem with ideas like this is that when they sound super logical, like this sounds logical, right? Like over time, society should get more complex, just like organisms do, is that we accept them uncritically. And then sometimes we run into some ethical problems. And this is what's going to happen. So, foreshadowing here. So, and finally, we've got some anthropologists coming into the work here. So, right on the cusp of the 1900s. So, Lewis Henry Morgan is like, okay, this idea is resonating with me of social evolution. And he's like, I'm going to try to codify this. I'm going to try to like make this into stages to try and map to what I think is happening historically. So, he came up with three broad stages that he thought that all societies on earth will or have passed through at some point, and he called them savagery, barbarism, and civilization. These are kind of the distilled form. You might see like a little bit of variation on the internet of like what these stages are called, but these are the main stages that I think are the less offensive. Sometimes people use some other terms that are a little bit more offensive, but yes, still offensive, still racist. But he was like, okay, three stages: savagery, barbarism, civilization. At any point on the globe, a society is going to be in one of these stages, working over time towards that last stage of civilization. So this is absolutely ethnocentric way of thinking, because who was the reference point for what civilized looked like? Yes, Europeans, right? They were like, okay, so here's what they're saying. Let me put it another way. They're saying that if you go to a hunter-gatherer society, and let's just say Ethiopia, for example, and you put them somewhere here in savagery or barbarism, depending on how your level of racism and your level of your lack of understanding of how the world works, that at some point they will become like Europeans. At some point, they will speak English. They'll use monetary systems. They'll dress in a particular way. And so basically, this was saying that Europeans were the peak of a way to the best way to organize people, and that other groups at some point will catch up to them evolutionarily. So they said we're the most evolved, basically, and other groups, if they're back here, they are less evolved. But where did humans start? Where did modern humans evolve? Africa. So if anything, European descendants are less evolved than African descendants. But I mean, we're all part of the same human species. So really we've all been evolving the same amount of time. So for them to say this, that Europeans are the most evolved, or to imply this in kind of hidden terms, is very racist and not correct. So any society that was seen as savage or part of the savagery bloc were considered stalled. And the benevolent Europeans out to help everybody, of course, what could they do? They should go to these places and help, and I'm going to put this in quote, help them speed along down this societal evolution line, down towards the civilization by mandating or forcing that they adhere to European ways of life. So this was referred to as the white man's burden. The white man's burden was to head out to all these places. And if you ever heard of what are they called? Mission trips, right? Where people go out and try to educate and bring religion with them to other places. This is a form of this. So white man's burden is saying like it's my job to go to other places and educate them about how to be more like me because the way I am is the best way to be. And anthropologists, myself included, believe this is very unethical, that you're imposing your ways of thought on a place that has not thought like you for generations, which means that they're going to lose a lot of their culture when you impose your way of thinking. And then when we get offended when somebody else brings their culture towards us and tells us we're doing it wrong. So this idea that Morgan is proposing that every society is going to head through this trajectory, through savagery to barbarism to civilization. That was called unilineal cultural evolution, that we are all going to pass through the points on this line to end up at this end point, which is European ways of life or white people ways of life. So unilineal is a racist, antiquated notion, and this theory that all societies are going to evolve through those stages, and that if you see something that is, less like European culture, that they're back here in one of these other stages. So these ethnocentric ideas like unilineal cultural evolution began to be challenged in the 20th century because people started thinking about what these words meant and what we were implying. And so Malinowski was one of the first, I mean, probably one of the first like really prominent people to publish work that was read by the community and start to change minds about this way of thinking. So I know this is a W, but it's pronounced like a V, so Malinowski. And he was a Polish anthropologist, and he got stranded on these islands called the Trobriand Islands, which are located near Australia during the First World War. And while he was there, he was like, you know what, I better make the most. These people are being really hospitable, letting me live with them. I might as well get to know them, make the most of my time here, learn some things. He's a scientist. So while he was there, this wasn't called this at the time. This wasn't a thing that people did. People were armchair anthropologists. They stayed at home, they read papers that travelers put out, and then they analyzed them. And that was anthropology. People didn't go and live with the cultures that they were studying. And that's exactly what Malinowski was doing. He lived with them, he worked with them, he slept in the same places as them. So pretty much participant observation is about being with your what we now call collaborators, but back in the past were called participants, hence the name here. But participants in your study, basically. But it's living with them, doing everything with them that you possibly can. So it's immersive, it's long-term research that's more than just you standing apart and taking notes on them. Because this builds up rapport, this builds trust with your community that you're actually there to benefit them. You want to share information. You don't want to impose your will on them. You don't want to tell them that they're wrong. You want to have this sharing and dissemination of knowledge. You want to learn from them too. So partisan observation will start to gain steam from here on out, and more people will start to practice it and realize that this is how you get the best answers to your questions, the most accurate answers to your questions, the most holistic answers to your questions are through this, not just reading secondhand publications, not just standing to the side and observing, because then you're treating them like they're in a petri dish. They're not going to want to share intimate details with you. So this becomes the standard and is the standard today for cultural anthropologists. So, how might participant observation methods facilitate challenging ethnocentric notions? It does. So, by living with these Trobriand islanders, Malinowski was like, oh, the way that the people have talked about them in the past is that they were these savage barbarians. They didn't know their ways of life. But he actually found out that the ways that they organized themselves, the ways that they divided labor, the ways that they raised their children, that these were very like well suited to where they lived, the types of resources that they had, and the size of their groups, that it made sense for them. So he was saying, this was actually pretty complex. Like maybe it doesn't have the governance structures that we have here, but it's very complex. And he developed a theory to explain like how so many humans across the world live in ways that are so different from one another. And he said, all right, well, we all have got different resources, but we're all human beings. So we've all got these basic biological functions like sleep, water, food that we need to meet, leisure time. If you're working 24/7 and you're probably going to go crazy. But we've got all these needs that we need to meet as people. And because we live in different areas with different environments, different resources, that we have all evolved different ways to kind of structure ourselves in a way that makes sense for us, for our resources, for our land, for our groups, for the things that we experience in that place. And this was like the beginnings of cultural relativism coming into play here, saying that it's not better or worse. It's just more, the way that we're acting and behaving and believing and the way that we think about the world as you move from group to group or place on earth. No better or worse is just different because we live in different places in different size groups with people who look different. So thus, evolution says that we have to adapt differently. So he was criticized, Malinowski was criticized for something called biological determinism. So this is the idea that all of your biology kind of comes down to your genes and your genetics. So he's kind of saying that like part of the way that we are so diverse comes from like a blueprint in our bodies that is evolved to adapt to a certain area. So like and part of this is true. So like people who live in the Tibetan plateau, that's a really high altitude environment. They don't need as much oxygen to grow and live as people who live at sea level, like those of us that grew up in California. But so yes, your genes play a factor, but not a huge factor. But he put a lot more kind of stock into this idea that you are evolved to a particular environment through your ancestors, and that everything that you were doing culturally was a reflection of basically your genetic information and who you came from. But despite that, this was a really, really early effort to be more open-minded about other cultures that were non-European and see the benefit and the complexity that they carry in and of themselves. So around this same time that Malinowski's doing this stuff and thinking these things, we've got a united. So he's I was a Polish anthropologist, remember? So he's from Europe, and now at this kind of around the same time period, we've got somebody in the U.S. that becomes a very prominent anthropologist as well, named Franz Boas, and he actually took kind of the ideas that Malinowski is floating around. And he developed cultural relativism as a perspective that was going to be used widely by anthropologists. So he said, same thing, I've kind of been beating a dead horse here, but that cultures vary, but none is neither inherently nor worse than another. And he insisted that physiology, our kind of our biology, our makeup, and our culture vary across what we call races and ethnicities because of not just our environment or our genetic makeup and our background, but because of our environmental and social conditions. He said that our behaviors, the things that, if I wake up in the morning, I drink a cup of coffee, or I go to a gym instead of doing really long walks, that a lot of those things are learned things, so if I go to Costco, right, I know I have to wait in the back of the line because if I just jump to the front, somebody's gonna yell at me. So these behaviors that I do, I'm not born knowing that. I either learned that by watching somebody and mimicking, or multiple somebodies and mimicking, or somebody told me. Like my mom was like, dude, you can't do that. So he said a lot of what makes groups the way that they are is that we teach people how to be in that specific space. So it's not handed down through biology, it's handed down through our brains and actively teaching. And that's culture. So primates can do a lot of mimicking, but the active teaching of how to behave, how to act, how to use a tool is something that's really rare. Some primates do this, but humans do it a lot. And that's what makes us pretty unique as a species. So Boas is actually so prominent that he is considered the father of all of American anthropology and the four field designations, plus our ability to use the four fields cohesively as opposed to seeing ourselves as four separate disciplines.